One of which would be potentially some rain. But the three main issues that we're bracing for: the wind. The wind field of this storm is expanding and could be strong for some of these communities. Waves will be on the increase, likely crashing onto the New England coastline, also increasing across other parts of the country, too. So you may not be anywhere close to this storm and see the waves kicking up. And then rip current danger all the way from Florida to New England as we finish off the week. All right, we want to look at the very latest with Hurricane Lee. Still dealing with 115-mile-per-hour winds with this, a Category 3 hurricane moving to the north-northwest at 9 miles an hour. So we've seen that west-northwestern motion switch to more of a north-northwestern motion, and that will continue here as the storm moves between Bermuda and the United States. It is right now 430 miles to the south-southwest of Bermuda. There is that forecast cone, and there is that pivot back towards the U.S. So portions of the New England coastline, Atlantic Canada, remain in that forecast cone. But as we said, effects may be felt well outside of that cone. So let's bring in Dr. Knabb, our hurricane expert, of course, former director of the National Hurricane Center, and talk about what is causing this to turn. So will the rip current danger. So if you do have plans to be out in the water, I don't know how many people are going to the beach, to get in the water this time of year, but you've got to be aware of that. So swimming near the lifeguards is truly critical. Look at the wave heights as we take a closer look near the storms. 34-foot waves near the center. Well outside of that, though, we've seen those 10 to 15-foot waves. So the waves increasing across the southeastern U.S., across Florida already. You can see wave heights of about 5 to 7 feet, actually 5 to 10 feet off the U.S. coastline. So into the Outer Banks, already seeing those waves pick it up, and the rip current danger remains high today. Remember, it was high yesterday. We've got those issues again today. So from areas south of Vero Beach all the way up to the Outer Banks, dangerous rip currents likely. Again, pay attention to those flags that are flying at the beaches and listen to the lifeguards. Large waves and dangerous rip currents, they'll continue to build here as the week goes on. So through the middle and end part of the week, especially with Lee hanging right off the coast, that's what we're going to be dealing with. Coastal flooding and some beach erosion is possible in areas. I'd especially be watching the Outer Banks, a little closer to the storm, obviously already getting in on some of those big waves. Rip current forecast today farther to the north. We've got northeastern beaches from Maryland and Delaware into Jersey and Long Island dealing with those high dangerous rip currents, or high risk of dangerous rip currents, and then moderate rip current risk all the way up into sections of coastal Maine into the Cape of Massachusetts. Long period swells, they're already underway, but the waves really pick up through the second half of the week. So in addition to the large waves, you got to watch for sneaker waves if you are out there on the rocks. I know this time we get a lot of people getting out there just to view or photograph the waves. Be aware of the risk they present. Rip currents expected into and through the weekend. Too soon to know the exact level of impacts in terms of beach erosion, coastal flooding. Again, we're going to be watching surge possibility as well with the location of this low making landfall or staying just off the coast. Tides are highest during new and full moons. We've got the strongest effects in places where we've got a large tidal swing, and that just so happens to be the northeastern U.S. A new moon headed our way Thursday, too. So tides highest during new and full moons. That's what we've got coming for the rest of the week, guys.
All right, Alex, thank you for that. Back with our hurricane.
We take you to Beverly, Massachusetts. We've got boats in the water, but the waves are picking up. Of course, a lot of coastal effects coming our way, whether Hurricane Lee makes landfall or not. So the boaters in New England, they are preparing for some type of impact. Officials warn they won't be able to save everyone's boat, given that there's more than 60 miles of coastline. You're already moving the boats. Love to hear that. So let's get you a look at the very latest with Hurricane Lee. Of course, a Category 3, still major hurricane, 115-mile-per-hour winds. And when we look at the forecast cone with this, where is it headed? Well, unfortunately, parts of New England still remain in that cone. Now, the cone doesn't just limit the impacts to that zone. We could see impacts well outside the cone, especially given the size of this storm. It is getting larger in size, even though the wind speed is expected to drop as we go through the rest of the week. Here is the European ensemble tracks. Short term, we've got a lot of agreement, and even in the longer range now, seeing more of that agreement of that S curve Dr. Knabb was talking about. So that shift back off to the west, that would put more New England areas, more New England coastline in play for the gusty winds, the rough surf, of course, dangerous rip currents up and down the east coast, and also rain. We'll be watching for that. So dangerous surf, large waves, rip currents expected, likely to be large, slow moving, and hazards will extend well away from the center, increasing risk of high wind gusts and coastal flooding there in New England. Guys, we've already got an expanding storm. Tropical storm force winds well outside the center, in fact, 200 miles away from the center.
All right, Alex, thanks.
Family fun forecast. Summer, perfect time to get into the out there, and we're wrapping it up. But Omaha, just one spot with plenty to do for the whole family. Float down the Elkhorn River, learn a little history at the Freedom Park Navy Museum. Forecast looking good. Temps staying in the 70s throughout the afternoon, getting close to 80. Another great city, Knoxville, Tennessee. Today, we've got clear skies out there, so the perfect time to visit the Sun Sphere. It is a one-of-a-kind structure, 360-degree views from downtown Knoxville. For the U.S., we welcome you back into Weather Underground on this Wednesday. I'm Alex Wilson.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Best. We'll check in with our hurricane expert, Dr. Rick Knabb, in just a minute. Storm Daniel is what was known here.
We've been talking about rain in some of these communities. Hurricane Lee, of course, the big attention getter right now. 115-mile-per-hour Category 3 hurricane, pressure 948 millibars. It is now making that turn to the north. So now, as opposed to yesterday, more of a north-northwesterly motion, 9 miles an hour, so still not moving overwhelmingly fast. And that motion to the north will continue as we finish off the week. By the weekend, we could be looking at a landfall in the U.S. or in Canada. So we've got portions of New England in that forecast cone, generally Maine, but it's going to skirt awfully close to the Cape. And remember, the impacts will extend well outside the cone and the center of the storm because this is going to be expanding in size. So the wind effects, they're not going to be limited to those areas inside the cone. We've also got big beach and water impacts, big waves and dangerous rip currents. Here is Saturday into Sunday, again, approaching, maybe making landfall anywhere from Maine into Atlantic Canada. Moderate to high rip current risk from South Florida all the way up to Maine today. So that's what I'm talking about. Through the rest of the week, things are going to remain dangerous in the water. Waves will also be on the increase, Mike. So especially as we get towards the second half of the week, watch as those large waves build as Lee makes its way off to the north, especially into places like the Outer Banks. Height of the impacts coming our way, Mike, by late week. We've been now watching the cone take that, last second shift back off towards the west. And a lot of people are going, what gives?
Yeah, well, we've always seen those ensembles on the left side going right near southeastern New England. So that is one of the possibilities that definitely still exists. And as we talk through this, I can't anymore talk about the track without talking about the size. And I'll show you how those are so interdependent in terms of how you need to prepare. But now we're getting much more confident that this is going to become close enough to southeastern New England as a hurricane, close enough to bring tropical storm conditions there. And you might think, well, why that little S-shaped track? And why is this trough not taking it out to sea like I thought it would?
Right. We would think, all right, this is going to continue to move and just kind of bump it on out of here, skirt it away.
Well, this is like a bus that's racing down the street and you're trying to catch it and it's going to outrun you. And so now you're going to have to walk and wait for the next one.
I relate to that so fully. Did you observe my college experience?
No, I lived it. I think I've had a similar experience. But watch how this trough over New England gets out of here and allows ridging to build back in. And that is what pushes Lee back to the left a little bit to catch the next ride out of town, but not before it is dangerously close to, if not right on top of New England.
Right, and we're going to be looking at the water impacts and, of course, wind, perhaps some rain, too, in a lot of these areas, because I think people get caught up in, like, oh, I'm not in the cone, but as you're pointing out, with this getting larger, we're going to see the wind, we're going to see the water well outside of that.
Yeah, and that size has to do with getting impacts outside the cone, but it also has to do with when those impacts will start. This is the forecast of where the center is going to be, maybe, on Saturday morning, although there is forward speed uncertainty with that. It could go a little faster, go a little slower. But look at, because of the size, because of the winds of tropical storm force extending nearly 300 miles on the north side by that time, we could get tropical storm force winds starting Friday evening. That's 2 days and a few hours from now. That is a full 12 hours before the center might come near or over you.
Yeah, giving credence to the size of this, because I think, again, we look at the timing and we go, okay, it's not till late Friday that we're going to have the issues, but with the leading winds out ahead of it.
And also look at this.
Yeah.
Here's the width of the cone, 225 miles across or something like that. The storm could be more than 500 or 550 miles across. So if it goes, this is the wind field if it goes down the middle of the cone. If it goes on the left side of the cone, you get the even stronger winds, maybe even hurricane conditions in southeastern New England. If it takes the right side of the cone, you're still getting brushed by tropical storm conditions. It's going to be a lot harder for this to miss with wind and water impacts in New England.
If it goes to the left side of the cone, we could see winds in New York City.
You could conceivably get some tropical storm force winds, at least in gusts there, and you could then bring the bona fide hurricane conditions to New England.
All right, lot to watch. Mike, and then we've got a lot more happening in the tropics.
We do. So we've got a serious threat. Category 2, winds have come down just a notch here to 110 miles per hour. We get everything you need to know here on Weather Underground. Thanks for being with us. I'm Mike Bettis.
I'm Alex Wilson. Dr. Nab, our hurricane expert, going to break it all down for you. But this was expected. We expect the wind speeds to go down. The thing is, the storm's getting larger. So we've got nearly 3 million people in Lee's cone. The threats, though, they're going to extend far outside that forecast cone with dangerous swells, damaging winds, and heavy rain.
All right, so we know that could be threatening parts of...
From Hurricane Lee. Again, now a Category 2, but increasing in size hurricane. We've got wind, we've got waves, and we've got dangerous rip currents all across the East Coast. Gosh, from Florida all the way to New England. Talking Florida to Maine, rip current danger is going to be significant, but the wind and the waves will also be picking up along sections of the U.S. East Coast. I think the more significant ones there into New England. There's the latest advisory, 110 mile per hour Category 2 hurricane. It is moving to the north-northwest 9 miles an hour. So again, it has not been moving quickly as it increases in size, churning up a lot of ocean. And that's why we've got all those problems in the water for areas that are still well away from the center of this storm. It is 420 miles to the south-southwest of Bermuda. It will skirt off to the west of Bermuda, east of the U.S. Oh, yeah, that's right. East of the U.S., west of Bermuda, eventually working to the north, so could make landfall into parts of Maine or Atlantic Canada. But Dr. Nab, we can't get all hung up on this cone with a large Lee dangerous rip currents and perhaps even some beach erosion, coastal flooding issues that we'll be watching for out of Lee as it eventually makes its way off to the north. Wave heights closer to the center of the storm, 33 feet. But even outside that and well outside that, we have seen 5 to 10 to 15-foot waves. So down towards the Turks and Caicos, man, the waves were kicking up. And even here along the East Coast, we've seen wave heights just off of the Outer Banks up to nearly 10 feet, 5 to 10 feet out there into the Atlantic. So the waves, you probably noticed, they've got a little more kick to them as we look at our southeastern Florida beaches even today. Rip current danger, that remains high. Everywhere you see the red shading, that's where the rip current danger is going to be more significant. So don't be surprised if you see those red flags flying. Listen to the lifeguards if you are heading to those beaches. I know we're post-Labor Day, so hopefully the beaches are a little less packed and maybe you're less apt to get in the water, but I know it's still warm, it's still tempting. So again, listen to those lifeguards, and if you are getting in the water, swim near them. Large waves, rip currents, they'll be building as the week goes on, especially here, gosh, by Thursday and Friday. Look at the Outer Banks. We've got big time waves, and you got to keep that in mind too. I know it's cool to go out and look at them or photograph them, but especially as we look up into New England, got to watch for those sneaker waves. We see people get swept off of rocks. So again, please use caution as you're out, observing. High risk of rip currents from parts of the mid-Atlantic into our northeast and New England beaches. Parts of New England still under a moderate risk even today. That goes up, though, as the week goes on. Wave forecast for the New England areas. Long period swells already underway, but the large waves, the rip currents, they're going to be expected by the end of the week and throughout the weekend. So again, it's going to be tough out there in the ocean. You got to think of those boats. Too soon to know the exact level of impacts and again, how much coastal flooding or beach erosion we could see. Also have to talk about the tides. They're highest during new and full moons, which we just so happen to have coming our way on Thursday. Strongest effects will be in places with large tidal swings, which again, Mike, just so happens to be the northeast U.S. So yeah, watching for that as well. Well, whether or not Hurricane Lee makes landfall, boaters in New England, they're preparing for some type of impact. Now, officials warn they're not going to be able to save everyone's boat, given that there's more than 60 miles of coastline. As we bring you back to a live view, we've got folks already beginning to move boats, and you're going to want to do that. Waves are picking up, winds will pick up as we move through the rest of the week. And again, beach conditions are going to be dangerous, both the sneaker waves and the rip currents. Although, again, I'm hoping that now that we're post-Labor Day, there's not going to be a ton of activity at the beach, but just know if you are heading there, it's not going to be the safest place to be. Forecast track from the National Hurricane Center brings this storm farther to the north, again, weakening but increasing in size. So we're going to be dealing with those gusty winds outside of the cone, along with all the water effects. And I think we'll be looking at plenty of rain making its way into parts of the Northeast and New England states of the United States, as well as Atlantic Canada. That's a spot to watch, too. Again, that snaky curve of our Hurricane Lee forecast from the European ensemble models. So moving to the north, northeast, and then back towards the north and west, making its way closer to, if not making landfall, into our New England states. You can see some of those forecast models even into parts of Rhode Island. So anybody in New England wants to be watching for this, and outside of that into interior parts of the Northeast, we could be looking at least some gusty winds. So dangerous surf, rip currents, large waves expected along the East Coast this week, likely to be large, slow moving, and Lee will have hazards that extend well away from the center. Already those tropical storm force winds extend 200 miles from the center, increasing risk of high wind gusts, coastal flooding, and heavy rain for New England. That starts, Mike, on Friday.
Alex, thank you for that. Let's bring back in our hurricane expert.
Get to your weather wellness, presented by Physicians Mutual Insurance, and talk rip currents. Rip current danger is high from parts of Florida all the way up to Long Island. Moderate risk into parts of Maine and even South Florida. So we're going to be dealing with really dangerous conditions in the water. So don't think, I'm in Central Florida, I'm way away from this. And this is going to be something that sticks with us through the week. So swim near lifeguards. And if the red flags or double red flags are flying, consider staying out of the water. Definitely do if there's double red flags. You are watching Weather Underground. I'm Alex Wilson.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Bettis, and we're going to check in with our hurricane expert, Dr. Rick Knabb, on Hurricane Lee. It's Category 2 hurricane right now, 110-mile-per-hour winds. It is going to be a
Hurricane Lee, a Category 2 hurricane right now, winds of 110 miles an hour. So as expected, winds are going down. But remember, the storm is getting larger. We've got a storm location 420 miles south-southwest of Bermuda. It's moving 9 miles an hour to the north-northwest. So it has not been moving fast, and it's going to take till the end of the week, really the weekend, for this to possibly make landfall into parts of New England, Atlantic Canada. That's where it's going to make landfall somewhere, but again, possibly into the U.S. Outside of the cone, though, we are going to feel the impacts. We're going to notice the wind. We're going to see the rainfall because this storm is increasing in size. So the impacts not going to be limited to the forecast cone. And again, while the wind speeds do go down, we're talking about a much larger area dealing with those wind speeds. Here's Sunday morning. Bangor very much in the cone, parts of down east Maine as well as Atlantic Canada. So you want to be bracing for a possible landfall. But again, even to the west, parts of, say, New Hampshire, parts of Massachusetts, parts of New York and Connecticut, watching, getting ready for some impactful weather courtesy of Hurricane Lee. We've got the rip current danger. That was high yesterday, high again today. So where the rip current danger is the highest, look at south central parts of Florida all the way up to Long Island. And then we've got moderate rip current danger from New England all the way to South Florida. So dangerous rip currents, a good bet anywhere you're swimming across the East Coast. Hopefully with less people at the beach now that we're after the Labor Day holiday, that'll keep folks out of the water. But if you are at those beaches, please be aware of that. Waves are also on the increase as we look towards the end part of the week. You can see those waves really getting larger into parts of the Carolina beaches, but you're going to notice the larger waves even into the Florida beaches. And of course, big crashing waves likely up into parts of New England. So got to watch for those sneaker waves too. I know a lot of times we want to get out there and look at the waves, take pictures of them, but they will also be a danger. Coastal flooding also going to be something we watch for, along with beach erosion, Mike.
All right, Alex, thank you.
Size, and so a lot of areas, especially into New England, are going to be bracing for the effects this weekend.
Yeah, so when we talk about the track, you can't talk about that very easily without talking about the size, because it greatly changes how we need to interpret what the track of the system is going to be, because it is going to be so much larger than the width of the cone, even with the cone 3 to 4 days out.
Yeah, so if you're outside the cone, don't write this off. You got to be watching this closely as we make our way into, say, Friday. You'll begin to see the impacts because of the size.
Yeah, and there's a lot of attention on that S shape of the track, and it's because of the two weather systems that will be dictating where it goes, in addition to high pressure over the Atlantic. And so each day, it's going to go a different jog, left or right. So the next 24 hours, maybe a little bit to the left. And then Thursday night into Friday, a little bit to the right. Friday night into Saturday, back to the left as the second trough approaches. So I don't want anybody to be fooled when they see it maybe Thursday into Friday, maybe starting to bend farther out to sea. It could come back again.
So if it goes north-northeast or east-northeast, don't go, oh, it's moving out. We do expect that turn back to the west.
Yeah, although even if it hangs on the right-hand side of the cone, it's going to be so large, you'll still get tropical storm conditions in southeastern New England. Now, track and speed and size and timing and all that. So here's Saturday morning where the forecast is for the Hurricane Center for where the center will be. Now, it could be a lot farther behind that or farther ahead. There's some speed uncertainty in the models. But because of the size, that's Saturday morning. But look at when the winds of tropical storm force, if the exact forecast is right, Friday evening. Yeah. We're on the doorstep of 2 days away. They could have to put up a watch tonight.
Right. So we see this move to the side of the cone That bullseye area gets us into some other very populated areas in the Northeast.
Yeah, so this makes it an interesting call from the Hurricane Center and the Weather Service. Do you put up tropical storm watch, or do you put up hurricane watch?
Right.
You have to put up a watch tonight, I think, no matter what.
Okay.
But if it follows the left side of the cone, then you are bringing the possibility of getting hurricane conditions into southeastern New England.
Places like Nantucket, even Boston, I guess, in play, and then the tropical storm force winds west of that.
Yep, and one thing I'm noticing in the models, too, this is valid Saturday morning when that forecast track from the Hurricane Center is right here. But look at how many of the models are a little bit past that, and some of them are behind and to the left. So if it doesn't get pushed to the northeast as quickly by that second trough, it might take a little longer to get there, but that gives it more time to bend farther to the left. So there are tracks that are a little slower and also making landfall.
Yeah, I was going to say there are a few more. Now that we get a closer look into eastern Massachusetts, parts of New Hampshire could be looking at significant effects.
Yeah, so I think any of these tracks are going to produce impacts here in New England. It's just the closer it is, the more west and the longer duration and more impactful this will be.
All right, Dr. Knabb, thanks, Mike. And not the only game going on in the tropics either.
No, there are other things to watch.
Continues on the Weather Channel. Hope you'll stay with us for Storm Center. They pick things up
down the Atlantic Basin. It is a live. Right now, we've got Hurricane Margot in the north central Atlantic. Then, of course, there's Hurricane Lee, and it is headed north toward New England. We break it all down for you. Thanks for being with us on Weather Underground. I'm Mike Bettis.
I'm Alex Wilson. We've got our hurricane expert, Dr. Knabb, in the house as well. Nearly 3 million people are in Lee's cone, but the threats are going to extend far outside of that forecast. Dangerous swells, damaging winds, and heavy rain.
We've had some really heavy rain in New England of late, so if we get more coming, that's just going to make maybe more flood threats, go up.
Tracking this one as it's made its way to more of a northerly direction. And by the end of the week, looking at a landfall either in New England or Atlantic Canada. Big threats, wind, waves, and dangerous rip currents. By the way, the rip currents extend all the way from Florida up to Maine through the remainder of this week and this weekend. But let's get you caught up on the very latest, newest advisory coming in just about an hour ago. 110-mile-per-hour winds with this one, a Category 2 hurricane. So again, as expected, the storm overall is weakening, but it's increasing in size. And so that means we're going to see effects well away from the center of the storm. It is moving to the north-northwest at 9 miles an hour. Right now, 420 miles southwest of Bermuda. It's going to skirt right between Bermuda and the U.S. That's prompting the rip current danger and also the big waves along the U.S. East Coast. But by the end of the week, again, we're looking at New England, more direct impacts for you guys. We'll talk about wind. We'll talk about water in terms of rain showers coming down. And Dr. Knabb, probably some larger coastal effects up here in terms of beach erosion and coastal waves. We're going to see the coastal effects really take hold into parts of New England by the end of the week and really this weekend with Lee working in. Wave heights. Look at this. By the center of the storm, we've got over 30-foot waves. Well away, though, from the center of the storm, 10 to 15-foot waves, and even approaching 10 feet closer to the outer banks of North Carolina. So waves have been on the increase at our southeast and mid-Atlantic beaches. Rip currents, the danger remains high. We told you about this yesterday, and this is going to be a week-long thing, so we're going to stick with it. If you do have beach plans today, tomorrow, into the weekend, be aware. The rip current risk is high. Pay attention to the flags that are flying and listen to those lifeguards. They are there to keep you safe. We look at our wave forecast moving through the second half of the week. Again, they are on the increase as Lee moves off towards the north. So between Bermuda and the U.S., we're going to see some significant waves, I think, out there in the Outer Banks. And again, parts of the Northeast and New England will also be looking at those very large waves. So you go out, take a look at it. I know they're cool to see, but you don't want to get too close, get caught by one of those sneaker waves. High risk of rip currents today from the mid-Atlantic, Jersey beaches, Long Island, up into New England, already dealing with moderate risk of rip currents. So that storm is way away from you, but we're already dealing with some of the issues. They're only going to get worse as the week wears on. Long period swells, they've already started happening. So the swell sets, they are long period, but by the end of the weekend this weekend, now we'll have those really large crashing waves. Again, rip current danger continues to go up, and coastal flooding, beach erosion, also something that we'll watch for. The level of those impacts still uncertain given the ultimate path of this storm. Moon phase, got to pay attention to that too. Tides are highest during during new and full moons. We've got the strongest effects in places where there are large tidal swings, which just so happens to be the Northeast U.S. By the way, we just so happen to have a new moon coming, Mike, on Thursday.
All those things spell trouble for us, unfortunately. So Dr. Knabb back.
More ahead on Weather Underground, more on Lee, and of course, So whether or not Hurricane Lee makes landfall, boaters in New England, they're preparing for some type of impact. Officials are warning they won't be able to save everyone's boat, given that there's more than 60 miles of coastline. We give you a live look at Beverly, Massachusetts. A lot of boats out there. I know this is, a place where a lot of folks have one. Start to move them. I've heard from some of you that you already have. Got to think about the waves. The beach problems are going to be more significant as we look up into parts of New England. Forecast from the National Hurricane Center does bring this into either New England or Atlantic Canada by the early part of the weekend. And the size of this means that even outside the cone, we're going to be feeling the effects. So weakening, yes, the winds, but the size will grow. So this will be an impactful storm for even areas that don't find themselves in the cone currently or ever. We look at where this is headed in the short term. European ensemble models do bring this off to the west of Bermuda, off to the east of the U.S. So skirting the uprights between the two, taking that turn back off towards the northeast and New England states. So again, a main landfall certainly within the realm of possibility. You can see some of the European ensemble tracks actually bring that even farther to the west. So not out of the question. If you are in New England or the northeast, you are watching this storm closely. Dangerous surf, large waves, rip currents expected along the east coast this week. The rip currents all the way from Florida to New England. This is going to be a large, slow-moving storm, guys, with hazards extending well away from the center.
Very good point there, Alex.
Your family fun forecast. Summer, the perfect time to get out there and explore, and with summer wrapping up, want to go to some cities, right? Let's start with Roanoke, Virginia. Add a stop at the Natural Bridge Park to your to-do list. You got various wildflowers, wildlife. You can even escape the heat by taking a tour of some of the deepest caverns on the East Coast. Omaha, another spot with plenty to do for the family. Float down the Elkhorn River, learn a little history at the Freedom Park Navy Museum. Forecast looking good with temps this afternoon in the 70s.
In Greece. We had flooding in Italy, and then it went and hit Africa. So what a storm.
Yeah, it's been incredible. Unfortunately, a year of weather disasters that we've been following. Now this latest one in Libya. We're going to continue to bring you updates on that. We welcome you back into Weather Underground. I'm Alex Wilson.
I'm Mike Bettis, and our hurricane expert, Dr. Rick Knabb, is going to join us here in just a moment. Stateside, certainly a lot of concern with hurricane.
Right, and then we are watching Hurricane Lee. All things Hurricane Lee, right? A Category 2 hurricane right now, 110-mile-per-hour winds. So as expected, the storm is weakening, but it's increasing in size. And so, we can't let down our guard. We're going to be looking at significant impacts, especially into New England and the Northeast by the end of the week and weekend. And we'll see those effects well outside the cone. So don't get so caught up in the cone. Of course, the cone telling us the likely path of the center of the storm. It could be on the left side. It could be on the right side. So definitely looking at a possible landfall into the New England states. Really, Maine would be the one to watch, Atlantic Canada. But again, those impacts will be felt well to the west of the storm. Rip current danger remains high, will stay high through the week and weekend. Watching for dangerous rip currents from Florida all the way to New England. Mike, over to you.
Alex, thank you.
Hurricane Lee makes its way closer to, likely to weaken, but with the expansive size, we're going to see the effects in all of these places.
Yeah, I think we're about a couple days away, a couple evenings away from getting at least tropical storm conditions in those locations. But in the next hour here, we're going to have a new update from the Hurricane Center, a new full advisory. And I think the wind speeds will probably continue to come down in terms of the intensity, but the size keeps growing.
And that matters when we look at this storm, because this cone that we so oftentimes look at and we kind of, rule our life by. That's just the center of the storm. So with this storm being so expansive, you're going to see the effects way away from that.
Yeah, because the storm is already significantly larger than the width of the cone is in 3 days.
Yeah.
We already know. It's baked in that the impacts are going to extend outside the cone. Not just it could, it will. Now, we look at the latest forecast from the Hurricane Center, and then we can kind of look at what the latest trends are in the satellite and the models. I don't see any, rapid changes in Lee. I think it's just a gradual weakening of the maximum winds. But then the track. This is still tough to iron out the details because we know it's coming north, and we know it's almost certain it's going to come in some part of the Gulf of Maine. But how much is this going to pull it north and then east before the approach of this one pulls it back to the west? So first we'll look at the main run of the Euro, then we'll look at the new ensemble. So hang on.
Ooh.
Okay, so there's the bend to the left over the next 24 hours. But then as this trough passes right by the north.
And misses it.
And misses it. It bends it to the right for a while, but then here comes that ridging building back in to push it back to the left. So it'll come back to the left, but on this latest run, it doesn't bend back as far to the left just because of really small, subtle changes in the strength of this ridge and this trough, but the overall sense of things is still the same. But look at the cone. And what would you do if you were a Hurricane Center forecaster? This is your previous cone, and now here's the new ensembles. That's through Saturday morning. There's Saturday night. And then you notice you still have two stragglers here that show a landfall. Most of them are still right down the middle of that cone. So I don't think the track's going to change that much.
No, the track feels pretty, we've been looking at somewhere from, say, down East Maine over to about Halifax. So Bangor to Halifax clearly is still the area of interest.
In terms of where the center will
Yes,
go.
exactly.
Yes, exactly. So it's a Gulf of Maine system, but I would say about half of these are still squarely putting New England in a potent tropical storm because of the size of the hurricane. And these few tracks, 10 to 20% of them, close enough to bring a really strong tropical storm and maybe even slight chance of hurricane. So the other big question for 5 p.m. is, if you're the Hurricane Center and Weather Service and you think it's time to put up a watch because we're 2 days out from winds of tropical storm force, is it tropical storm watch or is it hurricane watch? I don't know. It's close.
I was going to ask you, I was like, what if you're on shift, what are you picking?
Maybe you start with tropical storm watch and then wait to see if the trends go the other way and you go to hurricane watch. But in either case, we got 2 days to prepare for at least winds that are going to be expansive enough to produce power outages, because even if the track is perfect and doesn't change on this next advisory, the winds are arriving Friday night and they're going to last all day Saturday.
And you've pointed out, people here, they go, oh, we're hardy, we're used to these nor'easters, but we've got trees with a lot of leaves on them right now.
Yeah, this is a different time of year to be getting tropical storm force winds.
Absolutely. Dr. Knabb, thanks so much. Mike, not the only game in town. We got a lot happening in the tropics.
We do. Jason has come alive. We've got Hurricane Margot in the north central Atlantic. Then we also have Hurricane Lee, and it is headed toward New England. We've got all the details for you right here on Weather Underground. Thanks for being with us. I'm Mike Bettis.
I'm Alex Wilson, our hurricane expert. Dr. Rick Knabb with us as well. We got nearly 3 million people in Lee's cone. We know the threats, though. They're going to extend way outside that forecast. Dangerous swells, damaging winds, and heavy rain.
It already has been a bad week of weather for us in the Northeast. A lot of places have dealt.
Very intrigued.
Some good ones these days.
Right? And by the way, like, the weather payoff in the short term before we get to Lee, going to be really nice behind that front. Then we've got Lee, though, so it doesn't last long. Make sure you enjoy. Get that breakfast sandwich out there tomorrow morning. We've got a few impacts, significant impacts from Lee. 1, wind. 2, waves. Number 3, rip currents. And rip current danger extends all the way from Florida up to New England. So truly everybody in the East Coast up against those rip currents, at least coastal sections of the East Coast. Let's take a peek at the latest advisory. Again, we are awaiting one at the top of the hour. 110-mile-per-hour Category 2 hurricane moving to the north-northwest at 9 miles an hour. So it's over 400 miles south-southwest of Bermuda, going to skirt between Bermuda and the U.S. That's churning up the ocean, so the waves have been increasing. The rip current danger remains high, and eventually we are looking at landfall somewhere from likely Maine into Atlantic Canada. There's the forecast cone, but remember, this is the track of the center of the storm, so you're going to feel the effects outside that cone, especially if we look at a more westward track. You get the center of the storm on the westward flank of that cone, and we could see significant winds, rain, all of that into parts of interior sections of New England and the Northeast. So a lot of areas, a lot of populated places need to be keeping a very close eye on this one. Tropical storm warnings for Bermuda. And as Dr. Knabb mentioned, we could see tropical storm watches go up as we get towards the 5 o'clock hour. Enhanced satellite picture. There is the storm again pulling away from the islands of the Caribbean, and this will be skirting off towards the east of the U.S. churning up waves. We've already seen waves almost 10 feet closer to the Outer Banks. And when we look at the radius of tropical storm force winds, we've seen those extend hundreds, 200 miles away from the center of the storm. There's a look at the current gusts. Again, Dr. Knabb, we're well away from the center of this, and these gusty winds could cause us some significant trouble later this week into New England. Got big water issues coming courtesy of Lee. Look at the wave heights closer to the center of this storm, around 30 feet, but even well away, we've been getting into that 5 to 10 foot range. Take a look off the coast of the Outer Banks, wave heights nearly 10 feet. So you're noticing those waves on the increase across the southeast beaches. That continues continues through the second half of this week. And rip current danger, it was high yesterday. Guess what? It's still high today from parts of south central Florida all the way up into some of our northeast beaches. So this is just mapping you through the mid-Atlantic. We've got problems into Jersey and Long Island as well. Large waves, rip current danger will continue to build as the week goes on. So again, second half of the week going to be tough out there for the beach goers. I'm hoping that now that we're post Labor Day, there's not a lot of people going to the beach, but if you do, consider staying out of the water. You have to if the double red flags are flying, and listen to those lifeguards swim near them as well. Coastal flooding, beach erosion possible here across some of our southeast beaches. Of course, watching for more of those effects farther up into the northeast and New England beaches. There's that rip current forecast I mentioned from Long Island down to Virginia Beach and the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Already a moderate risk of rip currents into parts of New England. Long period swell sets are what we've got right now. The waves really going up as we get through the end of the week. By Friday, Saturday, Sunday, we're talking big waves with this big storm churning up the ocean. Again, too soon to know the level of the impacts as far as beach erosion, coastal flooding is concerned, because that's ultimately going to depend on the strength and the path of this, guys.
All right, thank you, Alex. We're going to do our best here to break down some specific.
Whether or not it makes landfall, boaters in New England are preparing for some type of impact, rightfully so. Officials are warning they won't be able to save everyone's boat, given that there's more than 60 miles of coastline. As you want to protect those boats. Beverly, Massachusetts behind me. We got quite a few boats in the water, and Hurricane Lee is headed our way. So whether or not it makes landfall in New England, you're going to feel the repercussions in New England. Closer look at the radar. Of course, we look farther to the south. Not much happening, but looking at the radar later this week up into sections of New England, rain will also be something we watch for. There's a look at the forecast. You can see landfall possibilities range from Maine over into Atlantic Canada. Whether or not this makes landfall, though, in your area, you're probably going to see the impacts, because this is going to be a big storm, already increasing in size, expected to continue to do so. So while the winds back off, the size grows, and so the impacts are going to be felt well outside that cone. A European ensemble tracks, you can see pretty good alignment now, even as we look into the longer range with that turn back off to the west, Mike. So wind, waves, rip currents, all sorts of issues.
Alex, thanks for that. All right, so we know that.
We welcome you back into Weather Underground on this Wednesday. I'm Alex Wilson.
And I'm Mike Bettis. Our hurricane expert, Dr. Rick Knapp, coming up here in just a second. Hurricane Lee, a Category 2 hurricane packing strong winds, 110 miles per hour.
Category 2 hurricane awaiting the new advisory from the National Hurricane Center. This will be a complete advisory with forecast track. Category 2 right now, moving to the north-northwest, 9 miles an hour. So that northern motion has commenced, and that's going to continue through the week. Looking at landfall somewhere between Maine and Atlantic Canada, likely, but the impacts will be felt well away from the cone itself. So that's just the track of the center. With the size of this in play, we're going to see a lot of effects in terms of rain, in terms of wind, ocean effects. And those, by the way, extend all the way down into Florida. Rip current danger remains very high all across, up and down the East Coast. There's the late Saturday, or rather Saturday into Sunday forecast. So throughout the weekend, we're going to see this storm, again, either just off the coast or making landfall in the New England states. Here's your rip current forecast today. Very few beaches left out of the high risk. So Florida, Mike, all the way to Long Island, they're going to go up into parts of New England.
Alex.